April 18, 1967, over the central highlands of Vietnam. The air was thick, wet, and already more than 90 degrees when Captain Alan Reynolds rolled his C-123 provider onto its final approach line. The jungle canopy below looked endless, a dark green ocean stretching toward Laos. His altimeter read 180 feet, too low for comfort. But that was the mission. The signal came through his headset. Spray on. Reynolds flipped the switch. 2,000 pounds of orange liquid under pressure blasted through the twin boom nozzles. From the ground it looked like a slow glowing fog. From the cockpit it looked like success. The operation was called Ranch Hand, and its slogan, painted half as a joke on the nose of Reynolds's aircraft, "Only you can prevent a forest." The joke wasn't his. It had started months earlier, after their first sorties turned whole valleys from green to brown in days. But that morning's flight was bigger. The target zone was an 80-mile stretch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline that moved food, trucks, and soldiers south. Command wanted every tree stripped bare. The mechanics at Bien Hoa had loaded the tanks with a bright orange mix labeled simply herbicide tactical. The label didn't mention its manufacturing origin or the trace contaminant inside it, dioxin. To the ground crews, it was just chemical dust control for the jungle. They mixed drums, calibrated pumps to 60 pounds of pressure, tested the flow at 210 gallons per minute, then sent the aircraft on their way. Reynolds had flown 36 spray missions already. He could run the route half-blind. The plan was simple. 4 aircraft in a staggered line, each offset by 300 meters, flying grid passes at 2-minute spacing. They called it cross-saturation, a way to soak every layer of vegetation by crisscrossing the mist from different angles. From above, it looked clean and mathematical, white trails drawing perfect rectangles through the green. He hit the mark exactly. Gauges steady, pressure constant. At full load, each aircraft could cover about 2,500 acres in under 15 minutes. That morning's run emptied in 10. Reynolds shut the pumps, climbed to 300 feet, and circled to rejoin formation. Below, he could already see the trees changing color. The mist clung to the canopy, drifted with the wind, and settled over everything. Branches, leaves, riverbanks, huts. Back at Bien Hoa, crews rolled in to refuel and reload. The smell of chemical drifted over the tarmac. Mechanics wore no masks. There were none to issue. They hosed down the spray nozzles, wiped them with rags, and lit cigarettes to burn the smell off their hands. Nobody thought much of it. The focus was efficiency, gallons per acre, runs per day. 2 days later, reconnaissance photos came in. The jungle was gone. Where once there had been a continuous green barrier, there was now open ground and twisted black roots. The aerial analysts called it the cleanest defoliation ever recorded. To the planners, it was proof of concept. To the air crews, it was routine. But on the ground, along the narrow rivers below the flight path, villagers noticed something else. The water turned cloudy, and fish floated belly up along the banks. By the 3rd week of operations, Reynolds's squadron had sprayed more than 150,000 gallons across 5 provinces. It was the most successful run of the year. Command issued a commendation. The pilots didn't celebrate. They were too exhausted. The heat, the smell, and the constant reloading took a toll. They called the chemical the orange stuff because that was the color of the barrels. Nobody used its real name. At first, there were small signs: itchy skin, nausea, unexplained headaches among ground crews. The medics chalked it up to fatigue and dehydration. Mechanics complained about sticky residue inside the spray lines that wouldn't come off even after repeated cleaning with fuel. One wrote in his maintenance log, "Lines flushed twice. Still oily." Smell remains. Another noticed that metal fittings were corroding faster than usual, like something in the mix was eating the aluminum. But the flights continued. Orders came down to expand coverage. The next target was a sector near Quang Tri, a heavily forested area with small villages scattered along the hills. The coordinates didn't mean much to the pilots. They just flew the grid. On May 4, 1967, Reynolds's formation crossed the same area twice in one day, first at dawn, then again at dusk. The spray patterns overlapped perfectly. Command praised the precision. Within weeks, intelligence units reported success. Enemy truck columns were easier to spot. Ambushes along Route 9 had dropped. The Air Force cited Operation Ranch Hand as one of the most cost-effective missions in the theater. Less than $2 per gallon of defoliant delivered. The numbers looked perfect on paper. No one in that operations tent knew that dioxin, the contaminant formed during manufacturing, could survive in soil for decades. No one told them it could enter the body through air, water, or food, and never truly leave. In that spring of 1967, they were still measuring success in acres cleared, not lives changed. Reynolds wrote in his log that night, "Mission effective. Coverage 100%. Jungle gone." He didn't know that below his flight path, people were already coughing, livestock were dying, and rice fields were turning pale. The war would move on. The chemical would not. 2 weeks later, Captain Reynolds was assigned to inspect the aircraft maintenance line at Bien Hoa. The smell hit him before he even reached the hangars, a thick metallic odor that clung to everything. Technicians were scrubbing the spray booms again, same as always, but the residue just smeared around instead of washing off. One of them joked that the stuff had a mind of its own. Another, a kid barely 20, was coughing so hard he had to stop and lean against the wing. No one wore gloves. No one thought they needed to. Out on the flight line, the orange drums sat stacked 3 high. Some had started to leak. The paint on the drums blistered from the heat, leaving rusty streaks on the concrete. Pilots stepping around them barely noticed. Everyone was focused on keeping sorties up. For every flight canceled due to maintenance or weather, supply convoys down the trail moved unspotted. That was the calculus of war. The only number that mattered was mission count. By July 1967, ranch hand had spread into Laos and Cambodia. Crews flew out of Udorn and Da Nang. Each aircraft carried a mix ratio adjusted for the region, 1 part 2,4-D to 1 part 2,4,5-T, stirred constantly by a small impeller inside the tank. The system worked flawlessly. Every flight covered thousands of acres. Every week, new batches arrived from Dow and Monsanto's factories back home. The base received so much of it that they had to build extra storage areas lined with gravel to soak up leaks. When Reynolds flew over recently sprayed zones, he saw the same pattern. At first a light yellow haze, then bare ground within days. He didn't know that dioxin inside that orange mix could survive more than a decade in soil, or that it could settle into fat tissue in animals and humans alike. He wasn't told. No one was. The command briefings focused on vegetation kill rates, not toxicity. In nearby villages, the results weren't measured in acres. They were measured in breaths. Locals reported strange smells after the planes passed. Burning eyes, headaches, crops that refused to grow. People brought sick animals to district clinics. Doctors didn't know what to tell them. They called it chemical fever. Children's hair fell out. Water buffalo collapsed in the fields. The rivers, once clear, now shimmered with a rainbow sheen. Back at Bien Hoa, pilots started complaining too. One squadron commander reported skin rashes that wouldn't heal. Another wrote that his crews were nauseous after long missions. The medical officer recommended more rest, better hydration. No one connected it to the orange stuff. That August, Reynolds's formation was assigned a new grid near the Ashau Valley, an area of dense jungle that intelligence called a natural fortress. They were ordered to clear it in 6 days. The only way to do it was saturation, multiple overlapping flights at minimum altitude. The pattern looked beautiful on a map, rectangles stacked end to end like tiles on a floor. The results were immediate. The canopy fell away like paper. The smell from the ground, though, was overpowering. A burnt, sweet odor that lingered even after the wind shifted. A few days later, ground troops moved in. The soldiers expected ambushes. Instead, they found a wasteland of blackened soil and empty streams. Trees stripped bare, animals gone, even the insects missing. They called it the dead zone. One of the soldiers picked up a handful of dirt. It was still warm, even though it hadn't burned. Reynolds's C-123s kept flying. Every sortie brought new adjustments, lower altitude, tighter grids, longer exposure times. The more precise the engineering, the more complete the destruction. The same precision that made the Corsairs' gun convergence deadly 20 years earlier now made the jungle itself disappear. At the end of that month, the Air Force hosted a small briefing for visiting brass. Reynolds and other officers were shown charts. Gallons sprayed, acres cleared, enemy supply drops intercepted. Everyone nodded at the results. Then one colonel asked a quiet question. "What happens when it rains?" The room went silent for a second. Then another officer said, "It drains downhill." Laughter followed, nervous and short. The briefing moved on. That night, the rain came, a monsoon that lasted 3 days straight. It carried the runoff from hills to rivers, from rivers to villages. The locals collected rainwater in jars, unaware of what was in it. The American engineers were back at the base, flushing tanks for the next run. By the end of the year, 1967 would set a record. Over 4 million acres sprayed, more than 34,000 individual sorties. The numbers looked clean on reports, but something in Reynolds's gut changed. When he walked past the drums, the smell made him dizzy. He noticed his hands tingled after touching the spray switches in flight. He asked the medic about it once. The man just shrugged and said, "Probably nerves, Captain. You're flying too much." He wasn't wrong. Reynolds was tired. But what he didn't know was that his own aircraft's filters, his uniform, even the air inside his cockpit, were laced with microparticles of the same chemical he'd been delivering for years. He thought it stayed on the leaves. He thought it washed away. He was wrong. By early 1968, Reynolds' squadron had been flying ranch hand missions for nearly 3 years. The tempo was constant, 2 sorties per day, 7 days a week. When the orders came down for another spray run, nobody asked where or why. They just checked their tanks, verified pressure, and flew the grid. The missions always looked the same from above. Perfect geometry. Square miles of color draining from green to brown. Rivers turning the color of rust. But the numbers on paper couldn't show what it felt like down below. Villagers abandoned fields that no longer grew anything. Families moved into bombed-out towns because at least the ground there could still support crops. Water buffalo starved, their hides covered in sores. Soldiers returning through those areas began noticing that the smell, that thick chemical sweetness, never really went away. By mid-year, Reynolds began to feel it too. His fingernails discolored, small sores appeared on his arms. The medic gave him ointment and told him to stay hydrated. He didn't make the connection, not yet. None of them did. One by one, pilots reported the same things: dizziness, fatigue, persistent headaches. The ground crews had it worse. They cleaned tanks without gloves, mixed barrels with bare hands, and rinsed themselves off under water spigots fed by runoff from the same area they were spraying. In villages near Quang Tri, people started burning their fields to try to make crops grow again. The soil turned to dust. When they replanted, the rice came up twisted and yellow. Chickens stopped laying eggs. In some families, babies were born sick, their skin pale, their limbs weak. The older villagers said the jungle spirits were angry. But there was no curse, just chemistry. The chemical name dioxin never appeared in the pilot's briefings. It was buried deep in manufacturing notes back in the States, a byproduct formed when the herbicide was cooked at slightly the wrong temperature. Factories were rushing to fill government orders, pushing production to the limit. A few engineers warned about trace contaminants in reports, but those reports stayed in filing cabinets. In Vietnam, it was just known as the orange mix. One day in late May, Reynolds visited a maintenance hangar to check on his plane. A mechanic named Daniels was cleaning the spray system with a fuel-soaked rag. His forearms were covered in blisters. He laughed when Reynolds pointed it out. "This stuff doesn't like me much," he said. A week later, Daniels was sent to Saigon for treatment. No one ever heard what happened to him after that. The missions continued until early 1971. By then, the U.S. had sprayed enough herbicide to cover nearly a quarter of South Vietnam. Reynolds rotated home that same year. He packed his flight jacket, his logbooks, and a few rolls of film from the cockpit. He never thought much about it again. But time has a way of keeping score. 10 years later, Reynolds was living in Colorado, working as a flight instructor. His health started to fail, skin rashes, fatigue, unexplained pain. The doctors ran tests and found traces of dioxin in his blood. When he reached out to his old squadron mates, he found they were suffering too. The same symptoms, the same confusion. Some had cancer. Some had lost children. Across the Pacific, in Vietnam, the legacy was worse. Whole districts near Da Nang, Quang Tri, and Aloy Valley recorded birth defects and illnesses for decades after the war. The jungles they had burned clean never fully came back. Even today, 50 years later, some of those same valleys are being dug up by teams of scientists in protective suits. They're not looking for unexploded bombs. They're testing the soil. It still carries traces of what those planes left behind. The total number of people affected is impossible to measure, but estimates run in the millions. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed instantly. 2 cities erased in moments. The orange clouds spread slowly and invisibly, but their reach was far larger. It wasn't a weapon meant to kill directly. It was designed to erase the environment, and in doing so, it erased generations. Captain Reynolds died in 1984. His medical records list cancer as the cause. His family later joined a lawsuit with other veterans claiming exposure to Agent Orange. It took years for the government to acknowledge the connection. Even now, many veterans and their families are still waiting for recognition. In Vietnam, they're still fighting it too. Not the war, but what was left behind. Children born decades later still carry the chemical's shadow in their bodies. Rivers still test positive for dioxin. Farmers still find barren patches that nothing will grow in. The mission had been flawless. Every target zone, every grid, every line of flight was executed with precision. The engineers had measured everything except the cost. And that's the quiet truth of Operation Ranch Hand. It was a perfect plan on paper. It worked exactly as intended. And because it worked, millions would live with its results long after the war ended. Please subscribe to the channel if you liked the video. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. We'll see you tomorrow with the next one.